So this piece analyzes the April 2026 U.S.-Iran ceasefire, arguing that contradictory official statements, recent historical context, and ongoing market volatility indicate the conflict is merely paused, not resolved.
Right, so let's just dive straight into the critique to see how we can strengthen this material.
Evaluating the alignment between the underlying premise and the evidentiary payload is, critical for an airtight argument.
Absolutely.
And the weakness here is that the narrative prominently features the concept of a setup, which implies a deliberate trap or like an orchestrated conspiracy. Yet the deep dive into the evidence actually points toward a deeply fragile, unworkable pause born out of mutual desperation and deadline pressure.
Yeah, I want to look really closely at how the author has structured this evidentiary payload because the tension between the chosen vocabulary and the actual historical facts is, well, it's palpable.
Hmm,
I mean, the text relies super heavily on the word setup.
right.
And when a reader sees that word in geopolitical analysis, they are culturally and intellectually conditioned to expect a mastermind, you know?
Like they're looking for the smoking gun.
Exactly. The smoking gun of a calculated, multi-step maneuver by one of the state actors. But then they read the author's meticulous timeline.
The assassination.
Yeah, the sudden February 2026 assassination of Ali Khamenei right in the middle of the Omani-brokered peace talks.
Mm-hmm.
And the panicked rollout of those completely contradictory 10-point demands regarding uranium enrichment. And obviously the Russian nature of the Islamabad talks.
Yeah.
None of this reads like a masterminded trap. I mean, it reads like an international panic attack.
I am stuck on the interpretation of Operation Epic Fury here, though.
Okay, how so?
Well, the material highlights that decapitation strike happening at the exact moment Omani mediator supposedly had a deal within reach.
Right.
Doesn't that highly suspicious timing justify the authors calling it a setup? I mean, if a viable peace deal is on the table and one side suddenly assassinates the opposition's supreme leader, the reader is naturally going to assume intentional sabotage.
I challenge that assumption because the causality in the text is incredibly muddy.
Muddy?
Yeah, because if the strike was the intentional setup, then the text needs to prove who benefited and how they orchestrated the subsequent ceasefire to their advantage. But the text doesn't do that.
Oh, I see.
It simply presents the assassination, then presents the desperate Islamabad talks, and sort of throws a conceptual blanket over the whole thing labeled setup.
Right, it leaves things hanging.
It prompts a massive, unanswered question for the reader. Was that decapitation strike the actual setup, or is the current ceasefire the setup?
Yeah, that's a great point.
If you claim intentional sabotage, you have to show the reader the deliberate intent and the mechanism of the trap,
Otherwise, it just looks like an intelligence failure.
or a horrific miscalculation amidst the fog of war. The evidence as it stands strongly supports a precarious pause or, an unsustainable illusion claim.
Mm-hmm.
But it actively weakens the setup claim because it showcases actors who have essentially lost control of the steering wheel.
So the suggestion is to realign the central framing of the piece to either substantiate the setup premise with specific evidence of an orchestrated trap or pivot the overarching thesis to focus on the ceasefire as a structural impossibility and a dangerous illusion.
Precisely.
Let's look at some concrete examples of how the author could execute both of those distinct architectural blueprints.
Sure, let's start with the first option. If the author is determined to maintain that setup angle, they need to anchor that premise in data that proves orchestrated foreknowledge.
Okay, like what?
Well, the perfect tool for this is already buried in the text. The $580 million options trade.
Oh, wow, right.
Yeah, the author notes this massive trade was executed a mere 15 minutes prior to the pause announcement.
Right.
So to prove a setup, explicitly connect that suspicious financial anomaly to the premise. Argue that this isn't a natural diplomatic breakthrough, but a managed event where institutional insiders were tipped off.
Yeah, financial data is incredibly persuasive to a skeptical reader because it removes all the ambiguity of political rhetoric.
Exactly. Show how that $580 million moved, and you reveal the blueprint of the trap.
Wait, if they abandon the setup angle entirely and go with the second option, don't they lose the narrative hook that makes this piece feel urgent?
What do you mean?
Isn't pivoting to the ceasefire illusion a bit, dry for a general audience?
I would actually argue the exact opposite.
Really?
Audience. The reality of a chaotic, uncontrollable illusion is fundamentally more terrifying and gripping.
Because it means nobody's in charge.
Because it means no one is coming to save the day. Exactly.
Right, right.
If they reframe the hook to emphasize the ceasefire illusion, they can use the Marsk statement about the complete lack of maritime certainty.
Oh, that's good.
They can juxtapose the fundamentally unoverlapping demands. Iran demanding all sanctions be immediately lifted versus Israel demanding the total surrender of enriched uranium.
Yeah, use those rigid, contradictory facts to argue that this is an unsustainable delay tactic born of exhaustion, rather than some clever trap.
Exactly.
By clarifying this exact causality and intent, the author will really anchor the listener. If the goal is to argue that someone is playing multidimensional chess, we need to see the board.
Right.
But if the argument is that the board has been flipped over entirely, the vocabulary needs to reflect that chaos from the very first sentence.
Precisely. The framing device must match the evidentiary payload. And once the reader trusts the premise, they will follow the author anywhere.
Transitioning smoothly between emotional, historical background and analytical market data is essential to maintain narrative pacing.
Mm-hmm.
And the weakness here is a severe tonal whiplash.
Oh, definitely.
The script abruptly shifts from the intense, historical recounting of the war's human cost, including the 3.2 million displaced Iranians, the 1937 civilian casualties, and the sudden ascension of the 56-year-old Mujtaba Khamenei, straight into Brent crude crossing $100 a barrel, a 30% surge in U.S. gas prices, and those $580 million options trades.
Yeah, the author has compiled phenomenal research on both the geopolitical timeline and the economic consequences. But stitching them together without a buffer creates a profound disconnect between the political causes and the economic symptoms.
Right. Reading this section feels like watching a gripping, tragic historical war documentary that suddenly cuts to a live financial trading floor broadcast without a commercial break.
Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like.
The mechanism of empathy in the reader's brain just hasn't had time to cool down. When you hit them with raw financial data, while they are still processing the forced displacement of 3.2 million people and the volatile political theater of a new supreme leader taking power, the brain rejects the numbers.
Absolutely.
The reader loses the emotional impact of the tragedy and the analytical impact of the market data because they feel like two entirely different essays accidentally spliced together.
Let's examine the cognitive dissonance that happens there.
Okay.
Human cost requires emotional processing. Market data requires analytical processing.
Right.
When you forcefully jam them against each other, the reader experiences friction, and that friction pulls them completely out of the narrative flow.
So, could the author simply insert a transitional phrase? Something like, meanwhile, as the political landscape shifted, the global markets reacted. Would that solve the whiplash?
No. That really just functions as a mere bandage over a structural fracture.
A bandage, right.
It indicates sequence, but it completely fails to establish causality. The suggestion here is to build a clear thematic bridge that explicitly connects the geopolitical and leadership instability to the ensuing market volatility, using the physical geography of the conflict as the narrative hinge.
Let's work through some concrete examples of how to build that geographic bridge. The text already mentions the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes.
We know it's a narrow waterway, roughly 21 miles wide at its tightest point, and handles a massive percentage of the world's seaborne crude oil.
Exactly.
That physical space represents the exact point where human conflict literally spills into the global economy.
And that is the perfect narrative hinge.
Yeah.
The author should introduce a transitional paragraph immediately after discussing the IRGC's pledge of total war under the new supreme leader, Mujtaba Khamenei.
Okay.
For example, they could write, "This unpredictable new leadership vacuum didn't just destabilize Tehran, it immediately weaponized the world's most critical economic artery."
Oh, I see.
Do you see how that phrasing pulls the political instability down from the halls of government and places it directly into the water?
I do. Yeah, it gives the reader a physical space to visualize, and the author can then frame the subsequent market data explicitly as the real-time consequence of that political unpredictability.
Right.
They could follow up with, because Mojtaba Khamenei and the IRGC were viewed as wild cards by the West, global shipping markets panicked. The immediate result was the weaponization of the Strait of Hormuz,
driving Brent crude past $100 a barrel.
By using the 21-mile wide Strait of Hormuz as both a literal and figurative bottleneck in the writing, we smoothly fuse the geopolitical narrative with the economic data.
Yeah, it bridges the gap perfectly.
You are taking the reader by the hand, walking them from the political assassination right to the edge of the water in the strait, and then showing them the tanker ships turning around in fear.
It makes the economic data feel like a direct, unavoidable symptom of the political disease, rather than just a separate list of facts.
Exactly.
And it also honors the human cost by showing how quickly that local geopolitical instability ripples outward. It connects the 3.2 million displaced Iranians to the broader disruption that leads to a 30% surge in U.S. gas prices. The human element isn't abandoned, it's traced through the economic fallout.
And when the transitions flow logically from cause to geographic choke point to economic effect, the reader doesn't experience tonal whiplash, they experience a compounding sense of dread, which is exactly the tone this analysis is aiming for.
Synthesizing abstract geopolitical risks into tangible, everyday consequences is required to fulfill the text's promise of economic survival.
Yeah.
But the weakness is that the conclusion rapid-fires several massive unresolved issues. You know, the untouched nuclear question, the lack of IAEA access to damaged sites, the Lebanon contradiction regarding Israeli strikes, and the crucial April 10th Islamabad talks.
Right.
But it stops short of explaining what these abstract risks practically mean for the general reader's future.
The source material's broader context explicitly promises to show the reader how to stay ahead of economic collapse.
Exactly.
But by the time we reach the final act, the narrative leaves its warnings strictly in the realm of foreign policy.
Yeah, it's very macro.
These are brilliant observations about high-level diplomatic dead ends, but for a general reader trying to understand future global risks, they remain abstract international relations bullet points. The piece misses the critical opportunity to translate these military standoffs into tangible impacts on the reader's daily life or long-term security.
I want to push back on the idea of translation here, though.
Okay.
If someone is reading a dense, deeply researched piece on the 12-day U.S.-Iran war and Operation Epic Fury, shouldn't we assume they already possess the geopolitical literacy to understand why a lack of IAEA access is a severe threat?
Well,
Does the author really need to hold the reader's hand and spell out the consequences?
it is not about holding the reader's hand. It is about honoring the specific social contract the author established.
Okay, fair.
If the promise is economic survival, the payoff cannot just be a geopolitical summary. A subject matter expert knows that lack of IAEA access means an unmonitored nuclear program, which means a high probability of regional war, which inevitably leads to a market crash.
Right.
But a general reader, even an informed one, looks at IAEA access denied and simply registers it as a bureaucratic failure for the United Nations.
That makes sense.
The author must bridge the gap between the macro-level diplomatic failure and the micro-level reality. The suggestion is to synthesize the distinct geopolitical threads into a unified thesis on the immediate global fallout, explicitly connecting the failure of high-level diplomacy to the reader's everyday reality.
Let's provide some concrete examples of how to execute this translation from macro to micro.
Sure.
Rather than just stating the nuclear question is untouched, the author must explain the direct, downstream consequence. Tell the reader an unmonitored Iran under unpredictable hardline leadership could trigger a regional nuclear arms race within months, potentially forcing the U.S. into a larger, draft-level conflict.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the IAEA lacking access isn't just a regulatory footnote, it is a direct threat to the reader's immediate family and future stability.
Furthermore, when directing the audience to watch the April 10th Islamabad delegations, the author should tie the potential failure of these talks directly back to the earlier economic data we just discussed.
Oh, I like that.
Tell the reader, if tanker traffic doesn't normalize after Friday's talks, the grocery supply emergencies and $4 a gallon gas we saw in March will become the baseline, not the peak.
Wow.
Give them the definitive translation. If X diplomatic failure happens in Islamabad, Y economic reality hits your wallet at home.
This approach brings the entire piece full circle.
Exactly.
It takes the highly technical research on disrupted liquefied natural gas exports from Qatar and the contradictory statements from the Pakistani Prime Minister regarding Lebanon and distills all of it into a lens the reader can actually look through. Grounding the final Watch These Signs section in the earlier inflation and energy data gives the reader a highly practical, genuinely terrifying roadmap of the risks ahead.
It transforms a piece of distant political analysis into urgent, required reading for personal preparation.
Yeah, it becomes sticky.
Right. When an author leaves their conclusions in the abstract, the reader closes the tab and moves on with their day. But when the author explicitly ties global supply chain failure to the price of the reader's groceries, the writing forces the reader to reconsider their own immediate environment in the context of the global stage.
To summarize, this material is deeply researched and builds a highly compelling timeline of the conflict, but requires structural alignment to reach its full potential.
Definitely.
First, focus on refining the framing so it perfectly matches the evidence, either by proving the setup with financial data like the options trades, or by pivoting to the terrifying reality of a fragile, impossible pause.
Yeah.
Second, smooth the transition between the political assassinations and the market reactions by using the physical geography of the Strait of Hormuz as a narrative bridge, curing the tone of whiplash.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Finally, clearly translate the high-level geopolitical warnings into tangible economic realities for the everyday reader, ensuring the text delivers on its promise of an economic survival guide. We highly encourage the author to apply these structural refinements and submit the revised piece back to us for another critique.